Before there was a kingdom, there was the land. The northern highlands of Ethiopia and Eritrea, today known as the Tigray Plateau, stood like a natural citadel, lifted thousands of feet above sea level. These rugged mountains, cloaked in red soil and carved by seasonal rivers, became the cradle of Axum's civilization. The earth here was generous. Its volcanic soils produced abundant harvests when worked with care. Terraces built along the slopes preserved the soil, and early farmers learned to cultivate teff, barley, and wheat, grains that sustained life and later fed armies and kings. Springs and rivers gave water even in the dry months, while forests provided timber and fuel. Few places in Africa combined fertility, elevation, and defensibility in quite the same way. This geography shaped a people who lived both in seclusion and in connection. To the east, only a short journey separated these highlands from the Red Sea coast. Through that coast lay Arabia, and beyond Arabia, the Mediterranean and Indian worlds. To the west stretched the interior of Africa, rich with ivory, gold, and exotic animals. The plateau stood between worlds, both sheltered and exposed, both remote and central. Archaeology shows that long before Axum rose, settlements flourished here. Sites such as Yeha in northern Ethiopia reveal stone foundations, pottery, and temples dating as far back as the 7th century BCE. The great temple of Yeha, built with immense finely cut stone blocks, still stands today as Africa's oldest surviving monumental structure. Its walls once honored the god Almaka, a moon deity worshipped in South Arabia but adapted by local peoples. The temple testifies to early contacts across the Red Sea and to the engineering skill already present in this land centuries before Axum's rise. These early highland communities were not isolated tribes. They were part of a cultural sphere that linked Africa and Arabia. Inscriptions found in ancient South Arabian script at Yeha and nearby sites reveal a shared literacy, while the later development of the Ge'ez script, an indigenous Ethiopian writing system still used in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church today, shows how local culture transformed borrowed forms into something enduring and unique. Daily life in these highlands combined farming with herding. Cattle and goats grazed in the valleys, while farmers harvested grain on terraced slopes. Clay jars stored honey, while iron tools, introduced by the early 1st millennium BCE, made agriculture more productive. Archaeological evidence of spindle whorls suggests weaving was common, producing textiles that could be traded. Even in these early centuries, the highlands nurtured a people capable of sustaining surpluses, supporting leaders, and exchanging goods with neighbors. Power first rested in communities that controlled fertile valleys and caravan routes. Leaders organized labor for farming and for building stone temples. They presided over rituals that bound their people together, blending authority with sacred duty. Religion was not separate from politics. It legitimized it. The mountains, rivers, and sacred groves were seen as inhabited by divine forces. The temple at Yeha was not only a religious site but also a statement of collective identity and strength. As the centuries passed, settlements multiplied. By the 1st millennium BCE, these highlands were part of a cultural network archaeologists call the pre-Axumite civilization. It shared traits with South Arabia but developed its own path. Pottery styles, burial practices, and architecture reflect both exchange and independence. The people of the plateau were already carving their identity, setting the stage for Axum's distinct culture. By the turn of the 1st century CE, something more took shape. Inscriptions in Greek and Ge'ez begin to appear, alongside the first coins minted in the region. The city of Axum emerged as the central settlement. Its location was strategic: fertile lands for farming, stone quarries nearby for building, and access to caravan routes that led eastward to the Red Sea port of Adulis. Axum was not born in a single moment, but it slowly crystallized as the heart of a growing kingdom. Adulis deserves mention even here in the beginning, for it was the key that linked the highlands to the wider world. Located on the Red Sea coast of modern Eritrea, Adulis became the principal port of Axum. By the 1st century CE, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek merchant's guidebook, already described Adulis as a bustling hub where ivory rhinoceros horn and tortoiseshell were exchanged for Roman wine, Indian textiles, and Arabian incense. That such trade flowed through Adulis shows how the highlands, though distant, were already tied into a global economy. But before Axum became an empire of trade and conquest, it was an empire of stone. The highlands were rich with granite and basalt. These stones would one day be carved into monuments that reached for the sky. But even in the earliest centuries, stone shaped the people's lives. Houses were built with stone foundations. Temples were carved from stone blocks so precisely fitted that even without mortar, they have endured for nearly 3 millennia. The land itself gave permanence to human ambition. Religion, too, evolved with the land. The worship of Almaka gradually declined, replaced by local deities and ancestral cults. The sacredness of springs, forests, and mountains remained central. This blending of foreign and local faiths set a pattern that would define Axum's future, a kingdom open to outside ideas, yet always reshaping them into something uniquely its own. By the dawn of the Common Era, the foundations were in place. A fertile land that could feed armies, a cultural tradition of stone building and sacred kingship, a script to record language, first borrowed, then made local, a port that tied the highlands to the wider world. From these elements the Kingdom of Axum emerged. Unlike Rome, whose origins were shrouded in myths of wolf mothers and warlike twins, Axum's beginnings were quieter, but no less profound. It did not announce itself with a single act of conquest. It grew from the soil, from terraces and temples, from the slow accumulation of strength in a land that both protected and connected its people. The highlands had cradled a civilization. Soon they would give birth to monuments that still stand, towering against the Ethiopian sky. The people of Axum would take the stone beneath their feet and carve it into obelisks taller than any built before them, silent sentinels that spoke across millennia. The story of Axum was only beginning. The mountains had given protection, the rivers had given life, and the soil had given sustenance. Yet the people of Axum sought more. They wanted memory, etched into eternity. And so they turned to stone, raising monuments so tall that even the sky seemed to bow before them. The cradle of the highlands was about to awaken into a kingdom of stone. They rose like giants against the highland sky. Long before cathedrals reached toward heaven or minarets pierced the horizon, the kings of Axum carved their memories into stone. The granite obelisks of Axum, some taller than 10-story buildings, were more than monuments. They were declarations and messages to the living, the dead, and the divine. The highlands had already proven fertile and protective, but Axum hungered for permanence, for symbols that could endure beyond a single lifetime. And so they turned to stone. Archaeologists believe the first stelae were raised around the 3rd century CE in the very heart of Axum. Each was cut from a single block of granite quarried from the nearby hills. Imagine the task. Thousands of laborers carving with iron tools, ropes, and wooden sledges. The largest of these stones weighed more than 500 tons. To transport and erect them without wheels, without modern cranes, was an act of both engineering brilliance and communal devotion. But these obelisks were not just feats of strength, they were works of art. Many were carved with intricate designs, false windows, doors, and stories in stone. The tall tapering shafts resembled multi-story palaces, complete with carved beams and doorways. To the people of Axum, these carvings transformed stone into eternal architecture, palaces for kings even in death. For these stelae were not random monuments, they were funerary markers. Beneath many of them lay royal tombs, vast underground chambers where kings were buried with gold, silver, bronze, and glass. Grave goods included jewelry, weapons, and imported luxury items from Rome, India, and Arabia. These objects spoke of power that reached far beyond the highlands. When an Axumite king was laid to rest, his stela announced to the heavens that he would not be forgotten. The greatest of these monuments once reached 33 meters, over 100 feet, into the air. Known today as the Great Stele, it was the tallest monolith ever erected in the ancient world. But it never stood for long. Archaeological evidence shows it collapsed, perhaps during or shortly after its construction. Its broken pieces still lie on the Axum plateau, a silent reminder of ambition that even stone could not hold. Yet even in ruin, the great stelae tells a story. Its carved details reveal the aesthetic imagination of Axum, not crude blocks, but living stone transformed into symbols of eternity. Smaller stelae still stand today, rising above the earth like ancient guardians. One of the most famous, a 24-meter stele, was taken by Italian forces in the 20th century, but later returned to Ethiopia. Its return was not just an act of diplomacy, it was a restoration of cultural memory. But what did these obelisks mean to the people of Axum? Historians see in them echoes of earlier traditions. Megalithic stelae had been raised across the Ethiopian highlands for centuries before Axum's rise, marking graves or sacred spaces. Axum carried this tradition to new heights, literally and symbolically. Where older stelae were rough and unadorned, Axumite obelisks became intricate, monumental, and permanent. They tied the living community to their ancestors, linking generations through stone. Religion, too, was woven into their meaning. The obelisks faced the rising sun, aligning death with renewal, night with dawn. They spoke of continuity. A king may fall, but his legacy stood upright, reaching toward the sky. Some scholars suggest the stelae mirrored Axumite ideas of the afterlife, stone palaces for spirits, where kings ruled eternally in another realm. The obelisks also signaled political power. Each towering stone required resources, labor, and coordination. Only kings with vast authority could command such projects. Their scale announced not just religious devotion, but worldly dominance. When foreign traders arrived in Axum, the sight of these monuments must have been overwhelming. Imagine merchants from Rome or India stepping off their caravans, gazing at towers of granite unlike anything in their homelands. The stelae declared this was no minor kingdom. This was a civilization of permanence. And yet, despite their grandeur, the obelisks hold mysteries. No ancient records survive describing exactly how they were erected. No text explains the rituals that accompanied them. We see the stones, we unearth the tombs, we admire the artistry, but the voices of the builders remain silent. In this silence lies part of their power. They invite wonder, speculation, and reverence. As centuries passed, the stelae field of Axum grew, a forest of stone where generations of kings joined their ancestors. Some stood tall, others fell, but together they formed a sacred landscape. To walk among them even today is to walk in the shadow of ancient ambition. The obelisks of Axum stand as Africa's answer to the pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, and the temples of Greece. They remind us that civilizations across the world sought eternity in stone. But Axum's monuments were distinct. Not tombs sealed within, but markers pointing upward, as if the kings of Axum wished not to hide their power, but to display it to the sun, the stars, and the future. And in truth, they succeeded. Nearly 2,000 years later, their stelae still stand. The kings themselves are dust, their names often forgotten, but their stones endure, whispering across the ages. The Axumites had raised their eternal monuments. Now, with the memory of stone secured, they turned their eyes outward. For a kingdom so rooted in permanence, they also longed for reach. And so they would build not just monuments of stone, but monuments of trade, conquest, and faith. The obelisks reached high into the sky, yet the ambitions of Axum reached even higher. Beyond the stones, beyond the mountains, beyond the Red Sea itself, a new destiny awaited. The kings of Axum were about to turn from monuments of granite to monuments of empire. The highlands had given Axum its roots in stone and soil, but it was the sea that gave it wings. To the east, the mountains descended toward the coast, narrowing into rugged valleys before opening into the Red Sea. There, at the shore, lay Adulis, a port that became Axum's window to the world. Without Adulis, Axum would have remained a regional power. With it, the kingdom rose into an empire that commanded the attention of Rome, Persia, India, and Arabia. Adulis was no ordinary harbor. Its location was perfect, sheltered from storms yet close to the maritime lanes that carried ships up and down the Red Sea. The coastline was dotted with coral reefs and rocky islands, but within its bay, vessels found calm waters and safe anchorage. Archaeological finds, Roman amphorae, Indian beads, glassware, and African ivory tusks confirm that Adulis was not a sleepy fishing village. It was a hub of exchange, buzzing with activity, where languages from across the known world mingled in the air. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek merchant's guide written in the 1st century CE, described Adulis in detail. It recorded the goods that passed through: ivory, rhinoceros horn, tortoise shell, and slaves leaving Africa; wine, glassware, olive oil, and fine cloth arriving from the Roman Mediterranean; spices, silk, and gemstones sailing in from India. The Periplus noted that Axum's king was powerful, respected, and capable of guaranteeing safe passage for merchants. To foreign eyes, Adulis was both exotic and essential. Caravans carried these goods inland, winding through dry valleys and climbing toward the Axumite plateau. The journey was long and arduous, yet it linked two worlds: the highland capital with its stone monuments, and the sea with its ever-changing tides. The flow of goods enriched the kingdom, filling Axum with wealth that could be turned into coin, armies, and monuments. Trade was more than profit. It was connection. Every amphora of wine carried with it the taste of Rome. Every bale of Indian cotton carried the touch of distant looms. Every lump of Arabian frankincense carried the scent of temples in faraway lands. Through these exchanges, Axum was woven into the fabric of global history. The Red Sea itself was a crossroads. To the north, ships could sail to Egypt, where Alexandria stood as one of the greatest cities of the Roman world. To the south, ships rounded the Arabian coast and entered the Indian Ocean, where monsoon winds carried them eastward to India and beyond. Adulis was strategically placed between these worlds. Control of this port meant control of a vital artery of global trade. Axum's kings understood this well. They invested in protecting trade routes, building fortifications, and ensuring that merchants found security under their rule. Axum's reputation as a safe and reliable trading partner made it the favored choice for Roman merchants seeking African ivory or Indian spices. By the 3rd century CE, Roman coins poured into Axum, not as tribute but as payment for luxury goods. So many Roman coins have been found in Axumite lands that scholars see them as evidence of a thriving, balanced exchange rather than mere plunder. Adulis was not only a port of goods but of ideas. Alongside wine and spices came words, beliefs, and stories. Merchants from Arabia brought tales of desert gods. Indians spoke of the Buddha. Romans carried news of emperors and wars. In this cosmopolitan harbor, Axum learned of the wider world, and the wider world learned of Axum. One inscription carved in Greek survives from Adulis. It records the conquests of an Axumite king, boasting of victories across the Red Sea in Arabia and deep into Africa. That it was written in Greek is telling. Axum wanted foreigners to understand its power. Greek was the lingua franca of trade, and Axumite rulers used it to announce that their kingdom stood among the great powers of the age. For local people, Adulis was a place of encounter. Farmers brought surplus grain and honey to exchange for imported wares. Craftsmen sold ivory carvings that would end up in Roman villas or Indian courts. Sailors from Egypt, Yemen, and Gujarat mingled in the streets, their accents and songs filling the air. To walk through the markets of Adulis was to walk through the ancient world in miniature. Yet Adulis was not without its dangers. The Red Sea was contested by many powers: Roman Egypt to the north, Arabian kingdoms to the east, and nomadic raiders inland. Pirates prowled its waters. Control of Adulis was not guaranteed. It had to be defended. This constant tension pushed Axum to strengthen its military and expand its reach, ensuring the safety of its lifeline. The wealth of the port transformed Axum itself. With ivory and gold flowing out and silver and wine flowing in, the kingdom minted its own coins, the first African polity to do so south of the Sahara. These coins bore the names and faces of kings, written in Greek and Ge'ez, a blend of local and global identity. When a merchant held an Axumite coin in Egypt or India, he held proof that Axum was no mere backwater, but a kingdom with authority, legitimacy, and permanence. Adulis also shaped Axum's faith. Long before Christianity arrived, incense burned in temples overlooking the sea, offerings to gods who protected sailors. The rhythm of the tides, the sight of ships vanishing into the horizon, and the stories of travelers inspired a spiritual imagination that reached beyond the mountains. Later, when Christianity arrived, Adulis became a channel for new beliefs as well, bringing texts, priests, and ideas from across the sea. The story of Axum cannot be told without Adulis. The city was the kingdom's pulse, beating in rhythm with the waves of the Red Sea. Without it, Axum would have remained a mountain realm of stone and soil. With it, Axum became an empire of connections, wealth, and influence. But trade and wealth brought new challenges. Rivals envied Axum's prosperity. Powers across the Red Sea competed for the same routes. To hold Adulis was to invite both admiration and conflict. Axum's kings would soon face the choice: defend their lifeline with walls, or extend their reach with armies. The waves of the Red Sea carried wealth to Axum, but they also carried whispers of rivalry and war. Beyond the horizon lay kingdoms that hungered for the same treasures. The kings of Axum would not remain content with trade alone. They would soon set their sails for conquest. The waves that once carried merchants soon carried warriors. By the 3rd century CE, Axum had grown too powerful to remain bound by mountains and markets. Wealth had filled its treasuries, monuments had filled its valleys, and merchants from Rome to India knew its name. But for the kings of Axum, trade was not enough. They sought glory beyond the sea. The Red Sea was both highway and frontier. Across its narrow waters lay Arabia, a land of incense, spices, and rival kingdoms. Control of these lands meant control of the arteries of trade that fed Rome, as hunger for frankincense, and India as thirst for gold. To the Axumites, Arabia was both opportunity and challenge. In the 3rd century CE, an inscription was carved at Adulis in Greek. Known today as the Monumentum Adulitanum, it preserved the voice of an Axumite king, likely Gadarat or one of his successors. In bold words, the king declared his conquests, victories over neighboring peoples in the African interior, and campaigns across the Red Sea into Arabia. He claimed dominion over tribes that had once defied Axum, extending his power deep into the land of incense. That this inscription was written in Greek is telling. It was not addressed to locals, but to foreigners. It announced to Roman merchants, Egyptian officials, and Arabian rivals that Axum was no minor player. It was a power that conquered both sides of the sea. The logistics of such campaigns were staggering. To move armies across the Red Sea, ships had to be built and fleets maintained. The same waters that carried ivory and spices now carried soldiers, horses, and weapons. From Adulis, fleets sailed northward to Arabian ports, where Axumite armies disembarked to fight in desert landscapes far different from their highland home. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms that Axumite power reached deep into South Arabia, particularly the region known as Himyar in modern Yemen. The kingdoms of Saba, Kataban, and Himyar had long dominated the incense trade. For centuries they had supplied temples in Egypt, shrines in Greece, and altars in Rome with the sweet smoke of frankincense and myrrh. To control these lands was to grasp one of the ancient world's most lucrative commodities. Axumite inscriptions boast of victories against Arabian tribes and the capture of fortresses. For the highland kings, these were not mere raids. They were statements of dominance. To hold both sides of the Red Sea was to command a true empire, stretching from Africa's highlands to Arabia's deserts. But conquest brought risks as well as glory. Arabia was not easily held. Its tribes were fierce, its deserts vast, and its kingdoms ambitious. Axumite control waxed and waned, rising with strong kings and receding when rivals pushed back. Still, the memory of Axumite armies in Arabia echoed for centuries, a reminder that Africa's empire could project power across seas. The campaigns also reshaped Axum itself. Soldiers brought home not just spoils but experiences of foreign lands. Arabian influences seeped into Axumite culture, in language, art, and religion. Likewise, Axum's presence in Arabia altered the politics of the region, tilting balances of power and forcing kingdoms to reckon with the might of a foreign empire. To foreign observers, Axum's Arabian conquests were startling. The Roman world, used to thinking of Africa beyond Egypt as peripheral, now encountered an African kingdom whose fleets could match their own. The Greek inscription at Adulis read almost like propaganda aimed at Roman eyes. a declaration that here was a power worthy of recognition, one that could ally with Rome or challenge it if ignored. Behind the grand inscriptions, however, lay the human cost. Soldiers perished on foreign soil. Families in Axum waited for sons who would never return. Caravans carried back ivory and incense, but also stories of deserts and battles, of victories won and lives lost. These stories became part of Axum's identity, binding its people together with pride and memory. The kings who led these campaigns carved their names into history. They were not remembered merely as traders or builders, but as conquerors. Their monuments stood in Axum, their inscriptions in Adulis, and their echoes across Arabia. In time, later rulers would build upon their legacy, using conquest not only to expand territory, but to expand faith. For when Christianity came to Axum, it too would sail across the Red Sea, this time not with swords but with scripture. The sea had been Axum's lifeline, now it became its stage. To stand on the shores of Adulis and watch Axumite fleets depart was to witness a kingdom stretching its hand across horizons. These ships carried not just warriors but ambition itself, carried on waves that linked Africa and Arabia in bonds of trade, war, and memory. And as Axum planted its banner on foreign shores, it began to see itself not just as a highland kingdom, but as a true empire, an empire whose reach was as wide as the waters it crossed. The Red Sea had witnessed the rise of a conquering power, but conquest was only the beginning. Beyond trade and battle, a new current was stirring, a faith that would transform Axum's destiny and etch its name forever into history. The kings of Axum were about to embrace a new god, and with him a new empire of the spirit. The empire of Axum stood tall by the early 4th century. Its fleets ruled the Red Sea, its monuments pierced the sky, and its name was whispered in markets from Alexandria to India. But while its power was formidable, a greater change awaited, one that would not be written only in stone or gold, but in the hearts of its people. This change began not with armies, but with a boy. His name was Frumentius. According to later accounts, Frumentius was a Christian from the Roman world. As a child, he and his brother Aedesius were shipwrecked on the Red Sea and taken to Axum. Instead of meeting death or slavery, the boy found favor at the royal court. Intelligent and curious, he grew close to the young Prince Izana, a future king whose destiny would be bound with his own. In Axum's palaces, Frumentius became tutor, advisor, and quiet missionary. He planted seeds of a faith born in distant lands, speaking of a single God, of a cross that conquered death, of a kingdom not of this world. For the highland people of Axum, accustomed to spirits of nature and ancient deities, this message carried both mystery and promise. When Izana ascended the throne, the seeds sprouted. Guided by Frumentius, now ordained as bishop by the Patriarch of Alexandria, Izana converted to Christianity. It was a decision that shook the ancient world. For the first time, a great African empire declared itself Christian, not by conquest but by conviction. The transformation was dramatic. Coins that once bore images of the disk and crescent, symbols of older gods, were struck anew with the cross. Inscriptions shifted from invoking traditional deities to praising the God of Israel. Temples that once echoed with sacrifices gave way to churches where hymns rose toward heaven. Izana's reign marked Axum as one of the earliest Christian kingdoms in the world, a peer not only to Rome, which had embraced Christianity under Constantine, but also a beacon to lands further east. In this shared moment of faith, Rome and Axum stood as distant but kindred empires, united by a new religion that crossed seas and languages. But Christianity did more than change symbols. It reshaped identity. Axum's kings now ruled not only as emperors, but as guardians of a divine covenant. Their authority was sanctified, their conquests framed as part of a larger destiny. The cross gave legitimacy that gold and stone could not. The embrace of Christianity also wove Axum into a global spiritual network. Ties with Egypt deepened, for Alexandria became the source of bishops and doctrine. Pilgrims traveled between Africa and the Holy Land, carrying stories, relics, and sacred knowledge. Axum was no longer just a trading empire. It was a spiritual bridge, connecting Africa to the heart of the Christian world. Yet the adoption of this new faith was not without tension. In the highlands, echoes of older beliefs persisted. Farmers still whispered prayers to ancestral spirits. In hidden corners, the old gods lingered, even as the cross rose above new churches. The transformation was gradual, layered, and human, a kingdom learning to wear new garments while remembering old skins. Ezana himself embodied this duality. His inscriptions praised both his victories as a king and his devotion as a Christian. He conquered in the name of God, presenting war not as ambition, but as divine mission. This blending of sword and scripture would become a hallmark of Axumite identity, echoing long after Ezana's reign ended. Foreign observers were astonished. Roman writers noted Axum's conversion with fascination, seeing in it the spread of a faith that was remaking their own empire. Traders from Arabia and India found themselves in a port city where the cross now greeted them. For some it was a sign of unity, for others a challenge. But within Axum, the cross became more than symbol. It became survival. As centuries passed, when rival kingdoms rose and fell, when Islam later surged across Arabia, it was Christianity that gave Axum its enduring identity. Even when its empire waned, the faith endured, carried in chants, manuscripts, and the carved rock churches that still stand in Ethiopia today. The decision of one king, guided by a shipwrecked boy, thus altered the destiny of a civilization. What began with whispers in a palace became the heartbeat of a nation. By the time Ezana's reign ended, Axum was no longer just a kingdom of trade and conquest. It was a kingdom of the cross. Its crown and faith had fused, shaping a legacy that outlasted armies, monuments, and even the empire itself. The cross had crowned the kings of Axum, and faith had reshaped their destiny. But with new identity came new struggles, for across the Red Sea, Arabia stirred with rising powers, and the deserts echoed with a call that would soon challenge Axum's faith and empire alike. The Red Sea, once a calm lifeline of Axumite wealth, had begun to ripple with new currents. By the 6th and 7th centuries, CE, the empire that had stood as one of the greatest powers of the ancient world, now found itself confronted by new rivals, not in distant Rome or Persia, but just across the narrow waters of Arabia. The deserts of the Arabian Peninsula had long seemed harsh, scattered with tribes and caravans. Yet in these shifting sands, a force was gathering that would reshape not only Arabia, but the entire world. In Mecca and Medina, the words of Islam began to spread. From prayer rugs under desert skies to powerful armies, a faith was being born that would soon stand shoulder to shoulder with kingdoms and empires. For Axum, this was both familiar and strange. The empire had already known the power of faith, having itself embraced Christianity under King Ezana. It had also known the sway of trade, for Axum's wealth had always depended on controlling routes that carried ivory, incense, and gold. But this new power threatened both faith and trade at once. Before Islam rose, Axum had played a bold role in Arabian politics. Under King Caleb in the early 6th century, Axum had launched a daring expedition across the sea into Yemen. At the time, Yemen's Himyarite kingdom had turned hostile, persecuting Christians. Caleb, armed with both piety and ambition, led an army across the waters to defend his co-religionists. For a moment, Axumite banners flew on Arabian soil, but victories are fragile. Though Caleb's campaign was initially successful, Axum struggled to hold Yemen. Rebellions flared, supply lines stretched thin, and local politics turned treacherous. Within a few decades, Axum's grip slipped, and Persian forces filled the vacuum. The dream of ruling Arabia faded like footprints in sand. When Islam arose in the 7th century, Axum was no longer the towering power it once had been. Its monuments still pierced the skies, but its strength was tested by shifting trade patterns. New routes bypassed the Red Sea, favoring Persian Gulf passages. Ports that once thrived on Axum's shores saw fewer ships. The empire that had once commanded oceans now watched as commerce drifted away. And yet amid these challenges, Axum showed a face of remarkable resilience. Islamic tradition itself preserves a story of Axum's nobility. When the first Muslims, persecuted in Mecca, sought refuge, they crossed the sea not to Persia or Syria, but to Axum. There, the Christian king, remembered in Arab sources as the Negus, granted them asylum. In his court they found shelter and dignity. While Meccan envoys demanded their return, the Negus refused. He listened as the Muslims recited verses about Mary and Jesus, and he saw in their words a kinship with his own faith. Out of compassion and principle, he protected them. For this, the Prophet Muhammad later praised Axum, declaring it a land of justice. This act did not make Axum a power over Islam. Rather, it preserved friendship at a moment of uncertainty. It showed that even as history turned, Axum's legacy of faith and diplomacy endured. But challenges only deepened. As Islam spread with astonishing speed, Persia fell, and much of the Byzantine world reeled. Arabia, once peripheral, became the heart of a vast new caliphate stretching from Spain to Central Asia. Axum, still Christian and proud, now stood as a solitary beacon across the sea. The pressure was immense. Trade shifted almost entirely under Islamic control. Axum's influence in Arabia shrank. Its ports saw fewer ships, its fields less tribute. The empire's people endured famines as climate shifts and soil exhaustion added to their woes. Isolation tightened like a cord, and yet the Axumites did not abandon their faith. They held fast to their churches, their manuscripts, their chants in Ge'ez. Where their monuments once testified to worldly power, now their resilience testified to spiritual strength. The Desert Challenge, then, was not only the rise of Islam, but the trial of Axum's endurance. The empire faced fading glory, dwindling trade and shifting power, but it carried within it something more enduring than gold or conquest: identity. For even as Axum's empire declined, Ethiopia's Christian tradition endured, a tradition that had taken root centuries earlier under Ezana, that had been watered by the courage of kings, and that would continue long after Axum's monuments lay silent. The Red Sea no longer belonged to Axum alone, and the empire's star dimmed against the rising crescent of Islam. Yet though the world shifted, the faith Axum embraced would survive in the highlands, preserved through centuries of challenge. Ahead lay decline, but also the seeds of a legacy that would outlast empires. The obelisks of Axum still pierced the skies, casting their long shadows across the highlands. But beneath their grandeur, silence was spreading. Markets that once buzzed with traders speaking Greek, Syriac, and Arabic now echoed with emptiness. Ships that had once carried ivory and gold from Adulis vanished from the horizon. The empire that had dazzled the ancient world was beginning to fade. The decline of Axum was not a single blow, but a slow tightening, a web of pressures woven across centuries. The first strand was trade. Axum had been built on commerce, its lifeblood flowing through the Red Sea. But by the 7th century, new powers controlled those waters. With the rise of Islam, Arab merchants redirected trade toward the Persian Gulf. The caravans that once climbed Axum's highlands found quicker routes elsewhere. The empire that had thrived as a bridge between continents now stood at the edge, bypassed by currents it could no longer command. The second strand was the land itself. The highlands that had nourished Axum for centuries began to strain under the weight of its own people. Deforestation cleared slopes for farms, but without trees the soil washed away in rains. Overgrazing left pastures barren. Droughts grew harsher. The same plateau that had birthed an empire began to whisper of limits. Hunger stalked the valleys, and famine gnawed at Axum's strength. The third strand was political isolation. Once Axum had been part of a network that stretched from Rome to India. Now with Byzantium weakened and Islam ascendant, Axum was cut off. Its diplomacy narrowed, its influence waned. The letters of its kings no longer reached across seas. Instead, rulers turned inward, guarding what little power remained. Still, the empire did not collapse overnight. Kings continued to reign. Coins were minted, though fewer, cruder, humbler than before. Churches still rose, manuscripts were copied, chants in Ge'ez filled the air. Faith endured even as worldly power dimmed. Foreign travelers noticed the silence. By the 10th century, Arabic geographers spoke of Axum as a shadow of its former self, a kingdom remembered more for its past glory than its present might. Ports like Adulis, once among the busiest in the Red Sea, lay abandoned, swallowed by shifting sands. Legends of this fading reached even further. Some tales tell of a mighty queen, known later as Gudit or Yodit, who ravaged Axum in the 10th century. Whether fact or myth, the stories captured a truth. Axum's great capital suffered devastation, its monuments broken, its kings scattered. From that time, the throne of Axum seemed no longer secure. Yet decline is never only an ending. Even as the empire's power waned, its people endured. The farmers still tilled their terraces, the priests still guarded their churches, the scribes still inked their scrolls. In hidden valleys and mountain sanctuaries, Ethiopia's Christian tradition was preserved. Axum's monuments, scarred but standing, bore witness. The stelae that had once celebrated kings now looked down upon silence. Their shadows stretched across empty fields, reminders of a time when this land was the heart of an empire. The decline of Axum was not a fall into oblivion but a transformation. Its empire faded, but its faith and culture sank roots deep into the highlands, preparing for rebirth under new dynasties. The shadow that spread across Axum was long, but it sheltered the seeds of a future Ethiopia. The empire's voice grew faint, its ports silent, its kings forgotten. Yet the faith Axum had embraced endured, hidden like embers in the mountains. From those embers in time a new fire would rise, one that would carry Ethiopia's story far beyond Axum's decline. The great city of Axum no longer rang with the clamor of markets or the arrival of ships at Adulis. Its palaces crumbled, its stelae stood weathered and broken, and its kings slipped into obscurity. Yet even in decline, the soul of Axum did not die. Like embers glowing beneath ashes, its legacy smoldered quietly, waiting for winds that would one day ignite it anew. The most enduring ember was faith. Christianity, first embraced by King Ezana, did not vanish with the empire's decline. In the highland monasteries, priests and monks preserved it with tireless devotion. They copied manuscripts by hand, filling parchment with verses in Ge'ez. By flickering lamplight, scribes recorded psalms, gospels, and histories, ensuring that Axum's identity as one of the first Christian kingdoms would never be erased. From mountain sanctuaries like Debre Damo, chants rose into the night. Hymns echoed across valleys, sung in the same ancient tongue that had once resounded in Ezana's court. These voices carried more than prayer. They carried continuity. While armies rose and fell, while trade routes shifted and kingdoms disappeared, the liturgy of Axum endured like a heartbeat. Another ember lay in culture and memory. The Ge'ez script, carved first into stone and later inked onto parchment, became a living thread of continuity. Even as Axum's political power withered, its language remained the sacred vessel of scripture and learning. Over centuries, Ge'ez would evolve into liturgical language, anchoring Ethiopian Christianity in an ancient tongue that whispered of Axum's glory. The empire's monumental stelae and fallen obelisks also stood as silent witnesses. Travelers, centuries after Axum's fall, marveled at their size and mystery. To them, the broken stones spoke of a forgotten age of power and wonder. Legends grew around them, tales of giants who had raised them, or kings whose pride had brought them down. In these stories, Axum lived on, not as mere ruin but as myth. In the villages and valleys, oral traditions carried fragments of memory. Elders spoke of kings who had ruled when the seas were still Axum's, of battles fought across deserts, of a cross lifted higher than crowns. These tales, woven with faith and history, became part of Ethiopia's identity long after the empire itself was gone. Even in decline, Axum's connections to the wider world left echoes. Pilgrims continued to travel from Ethiopia to the Holy Land, carrying with them relics and stories. Foreign chroniclers, especially in the Arab world, remembered Axum as a land of justice and sanctuary. Though no longer dominant, Axum's reputation lingered like ripples fading slowly across a pond. Perhaps the most important ember was resilience. Despite famine, isolation, and invasions, the highland communities refused to let their heritage vanish. They rebuilt churches from ruins, farmed terraces with patience, and clung to traditions that tied them to ancestors. When outsiders saw decline, the Axumites saw survival. These embers of legacy did more than preserve memory. They prepared the ground for renewal. Centuries later, new dynasties in Ethiopia would claim Axum as their heritage, tracing their legitimacy back to the ancient kings. They would see themselves not as inventors of a new order, but as guardians of an old one, carrying forward the flame lit in Axum's golden age. And so, while the empire's monuments decayed, its spirit endured in parchment, prayer, and song. The name of Axum was never lost. It lived in faith, in legend, and in identity. The shadows of decline had fallen, but in those shadows embers still glowed. Embers that would, in time, kindle a new dawn. The empire had faded, but its soul lingered, in hymns, in manuscripts, in broken stone that still whispered of kings and crosses. From these embers, Ethiopia's next chapter would rise, carrying Axum's legacy into a new age. In the northern highlands of Ethiopia, the winds carried whispers among the stones. The empire of Axum had faded, its markets silenced, its kings long gone. Yet still, in the heart of the plateau, giant shadows stretched across the earth, monuments that refused to fall, even as centuries turned. The stelae of Axum were unlike anything else in Africa. Carved from single pieces of granite, some soared more than 30 meters into the sky. Their faces bore intricate patterns, false doors, rows of windows, the illusion of entire buildings sculpted in stone. These were not houses, not palaces, but memorials to kings long forgotten. Each one was a frozen echo, a stone proclaiming, "We were here and we were mighty." Even in decline, these monuments astonished those who saw them. Travelers from Arabia and Europe, stumbling upon their sight, wrote of their strangeness and scale. To many, they seemed the work of giants or the relics of a civilization older than memory. The very silence of the stelae deepened their mystery. The largest of all, known today as the Great Stele, once towered higher than any monument of its kind. Though it fell long ago, shattering upon the earth, its broken pieces still inspire awe. The effort required to carve, transport, and raise such a monolith remains staggering. How had Axum's people moved these stones, some weighing hundreds of tons without wheels, without cranes, with only the strength of their will? The question lingers, unanswered, leaving the stones wrapped in wonder. For Axum's people, these stelae were not merely decoration but sacred. They marked royal tombs, anchoring the memory of kings into the land itself. To carve a stele was to write in stone a story meant to endure beyond parchment and beyond voice. Even as the names of rulers faded, the stones still spoke, their echoes carried in the wind. Alongside the stele, other remnants stood, the ruins of palaces, foundations of churches, the weathered outlines of walls. In them, archaeologists today uncover fragments of a vanished world, pottery shards, inscriptions, coins, each a small echo of the life that once pulsed through Axum's streets. Together they remind us that an empire is never truly lost, so long as its stones remain. But the stones spoke not only of power, they spoke of continuity. When Christianity took root in Axum, it too left its mark in stone. Ancient churches were carved, some into the very rock of the highlands. Their dark halls, lit only by oil lamps, carried chants in ge'ez that had once echoed in Izana's court. Even in decline, the faith carved into these stones remained unbroken. Foreign powers, centuries later, were drawn to these echoes. In the 19th and 20th centuries, explorers marveled at the stelae, comparing them to the pyramids of Egypt or the temples of Greece. Colonial powers even sought to claim them, carrying one great obelisk away to Italy, a theft that showed how deeply the stones still impressed those who saw them. Though later returned, its journey told a truth. Axum's stones had never ceased to matter. Legends grew around the ruins. In Ethiopian tradition, Axum became linked with the Ark of the Covenant, said to rest in the Church of St. Mary of Zion. Pilgrims came, believing that within Axum's stones lay not just history, but divine presence. The empire's echoes thus became more than memory. They became part of sacred destiny. For the farmers who lived among the ruins, the stones were companions. Children played in their shadows, priests blessed fields beneath them, and elders told stories of kings who had raised them. To live in Axum was to live among reminders of greatness, reminders that identity could survive even when empires did not. The echoes of Axum's stones carried far beyond Ethiopia. They whispered into global history, reminding scholars that Africa too had built civilizations of monumental scale. Against old prejudices that imagined Africa as silent in antiquity, the stones cried out, We were builders, we were rulers, we were dreamers. Time wore their edges, earthquakes toppled their giants, yet still they stood. Each crack and scar became part of the story, proof that the stones had endured centuries of storm and silence. The obelisks of Axum, the rock-hewn churches, the crumbling ruins, all together, they formed a chorus of stone. And though the empire's voice had faded, these echoes carried its memory into the future, where no forgetting could erase it. The stones of Axum still whisper, their echoes stretching across centuries, refusing silence. From these ancient voices, Ethiopia's later rulers would draw strength, shaping a new destiny built upon the memory carved in stone. Centuries had passed since the throne of Axum stood in power. The bustling markets had grown silent, the fleets that once ruled the Red Sea had long vanished, and the royal palaces lay in ruin. Yet the name Axum had not been erased. It lived in stories, in songs, and in the stones that refused to fall. For Ethiopia, Axum became more than history. It became identity. Long after the empire's fall, its legacy nourished the roots of Ethiopian pride. It was from Axum that Christianity had first entered the land, shaping a culture of faith that endured for centuries. The chants sung in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language, still carried the rhythm of Axumite prayers. The empire's memory also inspired rulers who came after. Medieval kings of Ethiopia traced their lineage back to Axum, claiming legitimacy by invoking its name. Even when new dynasties rose and fell, Axum remained the symbolic foundation. To say, "We are children of Axum," was to declare a connection to greatness. And beyond Ethiopia, Axum became a whisper across the world. Archaeologists who uncovered its coins marveled at the kingdom's reach, coins bearing crosses inscribed in Greek, found as far as India. Historians recognized that Africa too had shaped the ancient world, not from the shadows, but from the very crossroads of trade and faith. The myths deepened its legacy. In Ethiopian tradition, Axum was bound to the Queen of Sheba, to King Solomon, and to the Ark of the Covenant, said to rest in its churches. Whether myth or truth, these legends gave Axum a timeless aura. The empire was no longer just a chapter of history, it became part of a sacred story. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Axum was not in its monuments or myths, but in its endurance. Despite centuries of challenges, invasions, droughts, decline, its spirit lived on in the people who carried its memory forward. Farmers who tilled the soil of Tigray, priests who guarded its churches, scholars who uncovered its past, all became keepers of Axum's flame. The ruins of Axum today still speak to those who walk among them. To stand before a towering stelae is to stand before time itself, to feel the weight of a civilization that dared to carve its mark into stone. To enter its ancient churches is to hear centuries of voices chanting in unbroken faith. Axum whispers to us still, reminding us that no empire is ever truly lost, so long as it is remembered. Its legacy stretches beyond Ethiopia, touching all who hear its story. It is a reminder that Africa's past is not silent, but filled with empires that dreamed, built, traded, and believed. It tells us that history is not the property of one land, but the shared inheritance of humanity. And so, as the sun sets over the highlands and the shadows of Axum's stelae stretch long across the earth, the empire lives on, in memory, in myth, in stone, and in us. The story of Axum may have reached its final chapter here, but history never truly ends. It waits for those curious enough to seek it. If this journey through time moved you, then become part of keeping history alive. Share your thoughts in the comments, tap the like button to let these forgotten echoes be heard, and subscribe so you never miss the next great story from the past. Because just like Axum stones, your voice helps history live on.